Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. It's on prepping for next year's autistic students with Autism Understanding Scotland and Aberdeen City Council. We always want to know who are these people whenever we present, and I know that quite a lot of people know us already, but Hayley, who are you?
Who am I? So I'm Principal Teacher, Lead of Wellbeing for Aberdeen City Council. I am specialised in autism and supporting autistic children and young people. And I am neurodivergent myself, late diagnosed ADHD.
And my name is Marion McLaughlin. I am the CEO at Autism Understanding Scotland. I'm late diagnosed autistic myself. I was just diagnosed just over 4 years ago, and I'm an experienced primary school teacher. So before I moved into the third sector, I taught everything from nursery to primary 7 and all the stages in between. So education is definitely something that we're really, really passionate about. So in good teacher fashion, want to lay out some expectations. So what can you expect today? So we're going to talk about why supporting autistic students really matters. So what are the rights that autistic students have? And we'll have a little look at the professional standards as well, because I think that is something that doesn't really get talked about a huge amount. So let's have a wee look at that too. Hayley and I are going to have a little look at what are the benefits of supporting autistic students. And then we'll have some practical steps to take to ensure that your classroom is autism appropriate from day one and an opportunity to ask questions. And I know a lot of people might think, well, we're all about autism friendly because that's a term that gets bandied around a lot. But I think anything can be friendly, but it's to make it appropriate for your specific students is what we're more aiming for. Hi, autistic person is really friendly, right? But is it appropriate for that one? Okay. So to start off with, we've got some of the legislation that covers autistic people's rights. So all children in your classroom will be covered by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which does give them freedom from discrimination, that everything has to be done in the best interest of the child, that the child has effective access to education, and that there's respect for the views of the child. But autistic students and other disabled students also have two other bits of legislation which are really, really key that I think everyone who's working with autistic students should be aware of as well. There's the UN Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which again sort of covers freedom from discrimination, but it also talks about how disabled people, which includes autistic people, should have full and effective participation in society. So society should be as accessible to disabled people as it is to non-disabled people. That there has to be respect for the evolving capacities for people with disabilities. And one of the things that we find very often whenever we're talking about supporting autistic students is that they have an idea about what the autistic student was capable of previously, and it's very difficult for them to then see that autistic student has moved on and is capable of doing more and more and more and more and more. A lot of disabled people, particularly autistic people, are quite infantilized. And some people find it difficult to recognize that we are growing and developing. There's also the right to an accessible environment to live, work, and learn in. So that means that the classroom has to be accessible for the autistic students that you've got, for the disabled students that you have coming into your classroom. We're also covered by the Equality Act 2010. And that's a really important piece of legislation for families as well as students, because it means that you cannot be discriminated against on the basis of having a disability, being thought to have a disability, or because you're associated with someone who has a disability. And for a lot of autistic students, they have autistic parents and otherwise disabled parents themselves as well. So it means it's really important that the families aren't discriminated against on those bases too. There's also protection from indirect discrimination. So indirect discrimination can be when things are just set up in a way that doesn't support them, and then nothing is done to change that. So just because school might be open plan, if you've got doors that you can then close, then that should be done, which is an example. Yeah, and if it's not done, then that is an example of that indirect. There's also the right to reasonable adjustments at work, education, and in wider society. And it really importantly, it recognises that intersectionality as well. So a lot of the families that we support, it's not just that they're autistic, that they might be dealing with racism as well. There might be difficulties dealing with language barriers, gender too, because a lot of autistic people are part of the trans community. So that intersectionality of experience is also recognised there. So the autistic students that you've got in your classrooms and in your schools have got an awful lot of rights that I think a lot of people just aren't really aware of. Is that fair to say, Hayley? Because I'm aware that I've just spoken non-stop since we started.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's important as well to say, you know, there's still a lot of anxiety out there in identifying autism and autistic individuals as being disabled. But we, you know, if we said a few of our presentations, if you've seen us before, you'll have probably heard it. You know, disability isn't a bad word, and it's not something to fear. You know, it is what it is, and there's still a lot of taboo, as I said, and anxiety around that. So we want to break that and actually acknowledge it for what it is. You know, when you do that, you're more likely to be able to access and engage with those reasonable adjustments that make all the difference for the children and young people in your care.
Absolutely, yeah. But it's not just those legal responsibilities that we have that come from that come from acts and conventions. There's also the GTS and professional responsibility, right, Hayley?
Yeah, so if you, I feel like I'm lecturing everyone now. If you have a look at the GTCS standards for career-long professional learning, which is where kind of most teachers will be sitting at, it actually the responsibility gets more as you go through that. But even, you know, at provisional right through to initial and then career-long professional learning, it is a responsibility of all teachers, just as a baseline, as standard practice and expectation, to adjust and make reasonable adjustments to meet the needs of those in your care. I've pulled out a few here, and it comes all the way through, right through the standards, from, you know, your classroom environment, your school ethos and environment, and your own professional learning, and being able to understand and transfer your knowledge and skills into your classroom practice to support the learners. So I'm not going to go through them. Obviously, you'll know these yourselves, but just to highlight that it is a baseline, a very minimum expectation for all of us to make in order to meet the needs of the children we're working with.
Absolutely. And we always like to sell it as well. You know, there are reasons why we have to be meeting these, because when autistic students are supported, there's a lot of benefits for the entire school, not just for the pupil, not just for the class, but for everybody. And I think as well, you know, having been a teacher myself, whenever my students have been well supported and they've been happy sort of coming in, my autistic students have been happy coming in, the atmosphere is so much less stressed than whenever they've been struggling. All of the class are more likely to engage more in their entire lessons. And I think fewer sick days for staff and students is just a really good outcome for everybody. That promotion of acceptance of difference is really important as well, because if you can accept one difference, the fact that you have some autistic students, that's going to make it a lot easier sort of across other intersectional aspects that they might have. And it really does build that self-esteem and confidence for all. So if you're going into a classroom and you're thinking, I know that my teacher did this for me, I know that my PSA did that for me, I know that the head teacher has made sure that this has happened for me, that is going to mean that that child is going to be a lot happier going in as well. And attainment isn't everything, but it is important to know as well that they are more likely to attain. And I think better staff retention is another important aspect of it as well, isn't it, Hayley?
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, you know, I was covering a class once, and something that's talked about a lot is visuals, or a clear plan of a timetable of what's happening that day. And I know that I need that and always have needed that, and used to make sure that I hounded everyone, even my parents, as to what was happening, what's happening next, what are we doing? And that was my own need. When I was covering this class, it was interesting because I put a visual timetable up, and that doesn't mean pictures and symbols, I had written up, but really it was for my own benefit, because I need time to process what I was doing and have something up there. And I remember thinking, okay, I know I've identified there were two diagnosed autistic children in that class. I thought this will be good. This is what they need. And they didn't look once at the board or what was up there. That's not to say they didn't acknowledge it and it didn't help to support their needs. But what I noticed is that for so many others in the class, it really supported them. So when we say, autism appropriate environments and classrooms, it is to the benefit of all. And you're often, the strategies and adjustments that you make within your classroom, which we'll talk about examples of, have so many kind of filtering outwards benefits for everybody, for various needs or differences that can make a massive impact just to how the atmosphere of your classroom feels, as a kind of starting point. So it helps you, it helps them, it helps kind of set the tone of the school, and it's just a nicer place to be, really.
Yeah. Absolutely. And it really is good for that reputation, isn't it? Whenever other people can say, oh, that's a really inclusive school, that's a good thing for your reputation to be. Yeah. And it really, speaking as a parent as well, it absolutely builds parental trust whenever you know that the student is supported well. It makes it a lot easier. And I really have to say that I don't think that I appreciated when I was a teacher and I didn't have children myself yet, how much that can impact on the entire family whenever a student isn't supported properly. Yeah. And I think it really does expand on your own understanding of autistic students. I do remember that when I was doing my teacher training, I had a very specific idea about what an autistic student would be like. And that was really problematic because it meant I didn't recognize that I was autistic for a very, very, very long time. I should have recognized that I was autistic about 17 years ago rather than 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So that understanding of your own autistic students, because then you can see what autistic flourishing looks like, autistic thriving, less school refusal, less school phobia, which means better school roll numbers. And there's a lot less need for multi-agency meetings as well. So if they're better supported, then you're not going to be called out of class to be going to meetings quite as often. So there's a lot of reasons why it benefits everybody when autistic students are really well supported. And we wanted to come up with we found a couple of really nice images that we thought that would help to say how different autistic kids are. This is something from the Scottish Government's Different Minds campaign that we at Autism Understanding Scotland have done a lot of support with. And yeah, autistic minds don't think the same way, but different ideas make the world less grey, we thought is a lovely message. Autistic students bring a lot to a classroom. They can definitely bring a vibrancy to it that you maybe wouldn't have had otherwise. But I think a really key important message again is that all autistic people are really, really different. So if we have a look at how autism is portrayed in the media, this was very much how autism was portrayed to me when I was doing my teacher training. Whereas having worked with thousands of autistic people over the last 4 years since we set up our organisation, I think that you could still add a lot more into this picture and still see how very different it is. And all autistic people are going to need different things. All autistic people are complete individuals. So that's why it's important to take that time to get to know them individually, isn't it? Which does kind of lead nicely on Hayley.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So, we sort of prior to, if you know your class composition for next year and you know that there are children or young people in your class who are diagnosed autistic, or it's been questioned, or there's been discussions about it, or you just have an individual in your class that you think just needs that additional support, then there's some practical steps that you can put in place beforehand, and that could start from now if it's not already started, and certainly when you first get the class as well. So spending time with them one-to-one, and often this is the best way to do this is within their line of interest. That it's going to be key really for building that trusting relationship, and that investment, showing them and displaying to them that you're interested and you're interested in them and what they have to say, that you're validating the 15th time that they've told you what route that train takes on that certain journey, because you actually do care and you want to listen, and that you're not dismissing what they say, because what they're saying is important for them in that time. So that is a really key critical stage in being able to develop a relationship, finding out their interests and not being kind of too close-minded on this, something that they might be interested in now within their old classroom or with their old teacher, not old teacher, but you know what I mean, their previous teacher. It's not necessarily the interest that will come out with you, and that's not to say they're not interested in that anymore, but it might just not be a link that they've made with you and something that they kind of pull you into their world. So finding out their interests and being open-minded to kind of adapting to that, something that they might be interested in now. 7 weeks is a long time, and so what I would say is, if you know that they're interested in Minecraft, do not go and put a full Minecraft display up and have everything Minecraft labeled, because you've been there, I've been there before, and they've come in and it has caused a lot of distress and anger because they're not interested in it, or they didn't expect it, or they don't want it. So just being open to that and adjusting and giving them a voice, ask them what they want. If they can verbally say back to you what they would like, involve them in the planning of how their new classroom is going to look like, involve them in what their new space is going to look like, their seat, their name label, their peg label, involve them as much as you can. Find out what makes them happy. And that's not necessarily interests. It could just be going outside and listening to the birds. It could be running their hands through a cold basin of water. That's not necessarily their interest, but it makes them happy and it helps them to regulate. And as we said there again, listening to them, listening to their views, and ensuring that you're not dismissing them, and that you're taking that time to validate what they have to say and what it could be wildly unlinked in your mind, but listen to what they have to say, and acknowledging it is so important in those initial few weeks to build that relationship and trust.
Yeah. And I think sometimes if an autistic student is finding it difficult to sort of verbalize, or if they've got situational mutism or something like that at the time, then there's lots of different ways that you can find that out too. So you can have them draw pictures, you can communicate via writing, using the computer. There's a lot of different ways that you can communicate to find out some of those things too. But it's finding a place that they feel comfortable and confident in doing that, and that'll really make it a lot easier, won't it?
Yeah, it's important as well, if there are significant triggers that do cause distress for that young person. For example, I had an autistic young person who only kind of visually responded to blue pen on the board, and any other colors, doesn't matter how beautiful it looked, was very distressing for them. Now, I had that conversation with the previous teacher, who thankfully had told me that, and I took the young person, and they weren't able to verbally communicate, in spoken form very easily with me, but I had lots of whiteboard pens and whiteboards, and we just drew on them. And actually he chose green that time, and then he just wanted green. So I wrote my boards, and I had my board up in green, and that was just giving him that opportunity to extend and change and adapt. So I didn't assume that I had to just use blue and that was it, but also minimize distress. So if you know that there are triggers, what I would say is obviously acknowledge them and explore them, and make sure that you are supporting that reduction of trigger distress, but don't just assume that young person or child won't change, and that won't have changed over time as well, or there's no capacity or flexibility to change, because sometimes it's just taking a different route to support them in that.
I think that's a really important thing to be remembering as well for autistic students who are going through puberty as well. With all those hormonal changes, sometimes those sensory needs and preferences change quite significantly in quite a short space of time. So it's really important to have that in. I love that you let them choose with their pens, go and play around. What a lovely exercise today.
It was. I love green, so I was delighted, but I was just praying it wasn't going to be brown. I did put it out, but thankfully we gravitated away.
We've got some practical steps to take for getting ready for next year. So we know that you've only got about a week or so, but that's still a week or so where quite a lot of things can be done. So we've got an ND guide there, and my guess is that most of you are scratching your head and saying, "What's an ND guide?" Yeah. In the past, a lot of social stories have been used to teach children how to mask the fact that they're autistic or communicate in a non-autistic way. So a lot of people within the autistic community are encouraging folks to move away from that term social story, because it's something that they can associate with trauma. So we're generally talking about neurodivergent guides instead. So an ND guide is a really, really similar thing in terms of giving lots of information, but it's neurodiversity affirming, it's neurodivergent affirming. So in that, you can put in all the information that the student might well be looking for. And it's a really good idea to be doing that with the students, so then they're aware. So if they're going to be going in a different classroom, who their teacher is, if they're going to be going into a different door, if there's going to be different students in their class. So any of the information that they might want, putting all that into a wee document, and particularly if you can make that together with the students, so then they have that ownership over it. And especially for a lot of autistic kids, it's really good if you've got photos with that child in the new spaces as well, so then they can have a look at that and remind themselves that they've been there. Can be really handy too. Lots of advanced visits. And we know that in the last couple of years, it's been difficult to do advanced visits as much, but it's an awful lot easier now. So it's important to remember that we can do that. And that advanced visit could be, for a nursery student going up to visit their primary 1 class, from, the P6 student going into where the new P7 class is going to be. A lot of places have a meet the teacher day on the last week of term. Some autistic students will benefit from having more than one of them. So it might be an idea to sort of say, okay, so the class room is going to be busy with current year students, but maybe we can do it at playtime or lunchtime, or hang back for 5 minutes after school to go and have a look there. So quite a few of those if you can get them. And in that time, give that student the opportunity to take any photos or videos that they might want to take as well. Hayley, how many students have you got or have you had who are autistic who love taking photographs and videos?
I don't think I could tell you. I know a lot that don't like being in them, but I know I couldn't tell you one that I've taught that doesn't like taking them. What I would say about, what I would say about photographs is obviously, if they're taking them, that's fine. If you're taking photographs and putting kind of guides home, just be wary of how much that environment might change visually between now and August. So, when you've sourced Pinterest and your classrooms are looking insanely amazing, that can look very wildly different to how it looks at the end of term, like we do as well. I love that meme where it's teachers at the start and then teachers at the end. But just, it's kind of, if you want to obviously put photographs home of things that don't really change, so practical directional photographs, like this is the toilet, this is the peg area, this is the classroom environment, but just obviously it can look very different, which can cause more anxiety and not prepare for change and be a bit counterproductive. So just being a bit selective. If you plan to change your hair to purple by August, then again, being wary of what photograph you send to them as to how you look at the moment as well.
I do know a lovely teacher who's fantastic with autistic students. who does have a tendency to come in the first day of term with a brand new hairdo with different
Yeah.
color, might be curly, might be straight. And
Might
it's
have
always lovely.
Yeah, it might have absolutely no effect, but it also might, and it might not be
Yeah.
something you outwardly see that's
Mhm.
caused anxiety. So it's just, again, being mindful of this and what you kind of prepare them for and getting that balance, because not everything you can prepare for. Things do change. So
I think this is one of the reasons why, well, one of the other suggestions that we're going to have in a bit as well is, if you can, allowing the child to come in and visit on that first in-service day before the rest of the class comes in. Because by that point, you'll be putting the class together in the way that's going to work for you. You know, it's going to have the stuff on the walls that you're going to want it to. So then that would be that other opportunity to just get to know what it's going to look like before they go in school with all the other students. So we do understand pretty much everybody's going to have some child protection training in the morning. But then if you're in the classroom in the afternoon, then maybe even like a 5-10 minute visit, just to let the child reorientate themselves into going back into class, can be really handy, can't it?
can also really help with the parents and carers of the children, so that they can make those links out with the school environment as well, and talk about things as they are, to offer that reassurance and predictability as well. You know, if the parents are able to sort of express that and to confirm that with them, then it can be a massive help.
Yeah. Maps can be really handy if they're going to be going to some place that's going to be a little bit new. And for some students, they quite like a picture of, you know, a map of the classroom and what it's going to look like if you've got that information already, or that could be given out, you know, on the day before term starts again. You know, where am I going to be sitting? How close is it to the teacher? How close is it to my drawer? How close is it to the classroom door? All of that sort of thing.
Yeah. A lot of secondary schools have virtual tours now on their websites following COVID. So that's great. You know, if you've got primary 7 transitioning to secondary, or you've got a secondary pupil at the moment who's obviously got a new timetable starting or has just started, they can go on and source, and it can be a bit of an activity or game, you know, like, let's see if we can go and find the new science room, and where's this teacher? Let's see if we can find that. So there's that opportunity to visualize and kind of reinforce that change as well.
Yeah. A lot of schools do a really good job with the information passports. You know, they're all about me. And I think it's really good to sort of have a visit of that and make sure that there's a space of any other information that you want the teacher to know. And you'll get some really fun things in there if you have that as a regular space, because there'll be lots of questions and things that you might not expect from that child. But they might still be worrying about it. Will they still let me sit on a seat whenever everyone else is sitting on the floor? Might be a question. Will I still be able to use like a private question box, you know, in the classroom? So some of these things might be we think that they might want to have. So they might put some of that onto the information passport, but if you give them other opportunities to ask questions, then they'll really appreciate that too. Because sometimes, I mean, I know that as a parent and as a teacher, I sometimes thought, oh, completely, I've given them all the information that they could possibly want, and then they come away with something that has just blown me out of the water and I hadn't expected at all. But it's clearly really important to them, otherwise they wouldn't have asked, right? Yeah. And making sure that you build in plenty of downtime, because these big transitions are absolutely huge. And a lot of autistic students, whenever it's coming up for the summer holidays, there's the uncertainty of what's going to happen during the holidays. That lack of routine for some autistic kids is brilliant, but a lot of autistic kids really struggle with it too. So if they are going and viewing the new classrooms and spending time with new adults, giving them some downtime straight afterwards, so then they can process that information, is really handy. You don't want to go straight from here's next year's teacher to here's some new math.
And there's quite a lot of talk, you know, in schools about, oh yeah, there will be a 2-week honeymoon period, meaning that the child has heavily masked, and actually that's exhausting, and it causes quite a lot of dysregulation and distress. So where it might be a honeymoon period for everyone else, it absolutely isn't for them. I think that it's important to ensure that there's that downtime and breaks and spaces, even if you don't feel like they need it or they're showing that they need it. That's not to say that they won't. And actually, it should be just kind of part of their daily timetable, and to stop that kind of mounting up coming and that kind of distressed response a bit later. So it's just part of the transition as well.
Yeah. We often hear from families that they did really well in the first term and we don't know what's happened since then. And it's basically they cannot math anymore, and that's a really difficult thing for them to do. So helping them to not have to mask so much in school in that first term is going to mean the second term is going to be a lot easier, right?
Yeah. And by that time, we've done training on this before, there's meltdowns, and then, you know, there's complete burnout. And by the time an autistic child, young person, adult has reached that stage of burnout, it's very hard to come back from that. So we can't say how long someone can heavily mask. It could be minutes, it could be months, it could be years, and you don't see any of it. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. So I think it's, if you can put preventative measures in place, or build in regular breaks or supports for them, for sensory supports and regulation support, then it gives them more capacity to regulate within themselves within school, and you're helping them long term effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's where it's really important that schools and families work really closely together on that, isn't it? Because the child may appear to be fine in school, but if they're struggling to come in the first place, if they're having meltdowns before they come in at school, if they're having meltdowns whenever they're getting home again, that doesn't mean that they're okay in school. Looking okay in school and being okay in school are two incredibly different things, aren't they?
Yeah.
But that's why, revisiting and supporting sensory needs is a really, really important one. So check with the family, do they have a sensory profile? And if they don't, then there's they can always ask for one from occupational therapy, although that does have a bit of a wait time. So on our website, there is an example of a sensory profile and a blank document that you can use to help fill out one with the families. Then you can ensure that you're meeting those sensory needs as well. And for a lot of that could be really, really simple things. We have an environmental checklist that's on there too, where you can have a look at what the environment is like with the family to see if there's anything that does need to be changed. But so much of that can be really simple things like making sure that the blinds are down, making sure that the windows or doors are closed to eliminate environmental noise or background noise, making sure that they've got access to things like fidget toys. All of those are small things that won't cost any money at all, that make a huge, big difference. One of the things I've really noticed, Hayley, whenever I've been going out into schools, is the difference that there is in schools where there is no school bell, or the school bell only rings to tell children to come in rather than to go out.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's another thing, another marker, it's another stress trigger often, and it's just waiting. It's that waiting game, waiting for it to happen. So not having that in schools has made a massive difference.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Working with a special interest, I think we've kind of covered that a bit, haven't we?
Yeah.
And knowing that interest might change is a really important one. And I think especially if the child's ADHD as well as autistic, then they might have a lot of interest that they might flip between. And there is this idea that autistic people only have one special interest, which I think is hilarious.
Yeah.
If we were to sit and list all of mine, we'd be here for the rest of the day.
Yeah. Practically, a step for you, so you're not going and setting up all these wonderful laminated resources and then they're not interested, is trying to take a step back into what that special interest is. So for example, I've used this so many times, but I had a child who was very, very interested in giant squids, and one of the I could have very easily, and it would have worked wonderfully for a short time, had lots of resources, transitional objects, etc., of giant squid. But to save myself and also to branch out and explore other potential lines of interest, I generalized it to sea creatures. And I didn't, I had different displays and resources within that. And then I expanded it again, just trying to push that capacity a little bit and flexibility. So I moved it then from just sea creatures to general animals. We had sea creatures and different themes at the beach, which was close to the sea, and we had the harbor, which was close to the sea. And so I just nudged a little bit to see, and some things took off and some things didn't, but it allowed me to kind of assess what route things were going, but also link in with what they were interested in, keep a very topical line of discussion as well. So for you setting up your classrooms, if they're interested in Roblox, have a look at the bigger picture of that. Is there different aspects that you can tap into from that specifically? Is there kind of different kind of virtual characters you can build on that? Is there different games, different structures, construction that you can, again, move away from? So that would be my advice in terms of special interests and starting afresh in a new term.
And I think that's really good advice, Hayley. Yeah. And I think that advice about information about what the change will mean. It's one thing to say, right, you are going to be in this classroom with this teacher and this PSA, but what is that change going to mean for them? Are they still going to get help with X, Y, and Z? Are they still going to be sitting next to the same person? Are they still going to be able to do some of the things some of those reasonable adjustments that they've had before? Are they still needed? And I think it's a good idea to go back and sort of have a look at that. And again, those children are going to have a lot more questions that you won't expect. So it's a good idea, yeah, just to say, right, what do you want to ask about this change? Consistency of support where possible is brilliant. If you've got a really good working relationship as a PSA with an autistic student, and then you're then able to work with them again the next year, that can be really, really handy. Because going into a brand new classroom with a new teacher can be quite a daunting thing, but knowing that you're going to still have that same pupil support assistant working with you, or that you're going to be sitting next to your best friend, or that you're going to be able to carry on learning a little bit about giant squid the next year. So having a little bit of that consistency can make that an awful lot easier. So then it's not everything being pulled out from underneath you, that you've still got some grounding, some sense of ownership there as well. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's where support objects can be quite handy too. And when people say support objects, I think there's often this idea of, maybe like a classroom teddy that goes from one to the other, which can be the case, which can be absolutely brilliant. But for some autistic students, a support object could be taking a favorite book from Miss McFarlane's classroom to Mrs. McLaughlin's classroom. That could be, an example of a support object. It could be, a favorite timer. It could be a classroom teddy, but it could also be, this chair was really comfy and I liked it. Can I sit in it? It still fits me. Can I take that one? So there's a lot of different things that could be sort of used as a support object, right?
Yeah, and often they'll identify it themselves. So don't assume that you've got something that they will like, and that it will be, they might like it and it might be nice and appropriate for staying in your classroom, but that might not be their support object. So allow them to have ownership of that from the get-go, and whether they have one or not identified one at the moment, that might change. So if you see that they're a little bit anxious to go to music or to their next class, but they always have the same pencil in their hand, then say it's not normal or necessarily appropriate in terms of the actual subject choice to need a pencil. You don't normally take a pencil to PE or to music, but there's no harm in them taking it, and that could be the absolute help and support that they need, just to feel that little bit more secure and to manage and cope with the change. So it's just, again, it's being mindful and just observant of what they are accessing and what they're using to support them in that moment.
Yeah. And sometimes little fidget objects can be really handy with that too. And a lot of families are quite handy to sort of put in some favorite fidget objects with the child, but it can be incredibly handy to have some already in the classroom. and ready to go. Yeah. Some autistic students might benefit from some mental health support whenever they're going through big changes, especially if it's moving from primary to secondary. If they're not going to be with the same group of friends, if they're really particularly worried about that. So that might be handy if their anxiety sort of becomes a big barrier to them being able to access things. Nobody should ever be getting mental health support to help them to be resilient to an environment that is not supportive of their needs. But they might benefit from some mental anxiety is getting really high and stopping them from thriving in an environment that it should be supportive to them. Yeah. Peer support can be fantastic. And I think, again, as a teacher, I think I maybe undervalued this. But having some identified peer support is a really, really good thing. And, you know, for your student who really liked the giant squids, you were able to do something pretty special with that, weren't you?
I was, yeah. They were transitioning to secondary, and the other individual that I managed to identify as a peer support for them was also very into sea creatures. So again, it was just a kind of by coincidence. But I had also purposefully put it into discussion to see if there was anyone that could, you know, link up that they knew of. Now, it's worth noting this other individual, young person, and who was S4 at the time, didn't have a diagnosis of autism, although probably were autistic. That wasn't the defining link, if you like. It was the interest, and that's what bonded them. And it was massive. I think they still are in touch today, I believe, you know, that and I think their interests have wildly changed and developed, but just having someone who could kind of tap into that world and have that conversation with them really helped to ease that stress and anxiety. So if you're doing transition meetings, or you are getting a different age or stage, you know, have a think a little bit again out the box of, okay, they're really interested in My Little Pony. Did I have anyone in my last class, or know anyone else in the school who has a horse even, you know? And that it might be a flat pancake on the floor kind of situation, but it might not be. You know, you could be putting a lot of support in place by just linking a special interest. So have a think if that's something that you could explore, because they're much more likely to feel at ease with a peer than they are necessarily lots of adults around them trying to engage with them if they're of a certain age. So yeah, it can be massively supportive.
I do know a couple of autistic bronies, guys who are into My Little Pony. Yeah, it's a thing. Yeah, definitely. And you know, why wouldn't you be? It's fantastic. And the toys are brilliant too. So yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of autistic students as well benefit from being the one who is giving some peer support too. So that responsibility. So if you've got an autistic student who is moving into P7 or P6, and you know that you've got some autistic P1s coming in, then giving them the opportunity to do a little bit of peer support or peer mentoring with them can be another good thing for them, for their self-confidence, their self-esteem. Because I think there is a big thing sort of knowing that you're one of the big kids in the school, you know, that you're one of the oldest. So, you know, doing something practical that shows that, yeah, I trust you, I'm giving you this responsibility. I see you as somebody who is capable and competent. That's a big message to be sending to an autistic student, isn't it?
Yeah, and I actually had that very recently, where I know P7 buddies are a big thing, and a huge support for both the age and stage. But I had an autistic young person who's going into primary 7, and they weren't asked to be a buddy or given the application form to submit, because it was assumed that they wouldn't want to do it because they don't really engage with school. And actually, I happened to have an off kind of track conversation with them, and they were desperate to be a peer mentor, to be a buddy, and that has been the changing factor for them and their engagement with school, having that responsibility and role and connection with someone younger. So again, it's listening to them and giving them options and not making assumptions, because it can be hugely beneficial to both, to have that responsibility and role in helping other people and mentoring.
It's the same with things like prefects, head boy, head girl, head pupil, that kind of thing as well. I remember being a prefect whenever I was in high school and really enjoying that extra responsibility. So yeah, it shouldn't be sort of assumed that they wouldn't want that kind of, or class rep on various working groups as well can be a really, really good one. I think sorry, Hayley, go on.
I was just going to say very quickly, for young people as well, certainly in secondary, it can help them feel more secure by having a structure of, or a role, because they then know that they have a role to play. They see themselves as part of the school. They see themselves as having something specific to focus on, as opposed to sometimes what has been described to me recently as I just feel lost amongst the pond, I think is what you'd said. And so you're giving them that structure and you're providing them with that bit, again, predictability and control, and sort of support their identity as part of the school. So it can be hugely helpful.
Absolutely. And when we talk about a mentor, that could be a peer mentor, but it could also be like an assigned member of staff that student can then go and speak to if they've got any concerns. A dear friend of mine who works in tertiary education has provided that role to a few of her students, where they would sort of maybe start off going once a week to have a check-in, then that might stay once a week for a long time, then it might go to once a month, once a term, and then it might not be needed at all at any point. But knowing that there was somebody that they trust, who may not necessarily have any other connection to their class, but having that person identified can make a huge, big difference. So if that's something that the student is identifying that they would like to have, then that can really be a big thing. And it's something that we do see in employment as well. A lot of autistic people that we know in employment might want to have somebody who is not in their department at work that they can still go to if they've got any concerns. So then they don't need to worry about complaining about their boss to their boss, but they can go and take that to somebody else who can then support them to deal with that issue. So that can be quite handy as well. So, you don't want to, if you're having an issue with a particular teacher because they're not explaining the work in a way that's going to work for you, then you don't want to have that person as being your assigned mentor, as somebody that's sort of overseeing you. We also put together some information for supporting some specific transitions as well. So if you've got an autistic student who is starting nursery, for example, then there's some things that can be done. We're going to send copies of this to a PDF of this to Barry. Then she'll be able to send it out to everybody afterwards. So we don't need to go through each individual step because a lot of them are ones that we've sort of had before. But some of them are really quite nice little things. Like I remember talking with a school previously about getting the current P1 children to make a book for the upcoming kids who are in nursery who are about to start P1, so then they can see what P1 is all about. And that's a really lovely little thing that they can do. There's lots of literacy, there could be some math in there, some art, some photography. So that, things like that can be a really nice little class project, can't it? Yeah. Any others that you would particularly point out, Hayley?
I don't think so. I think that there is, it's again just making school as accessible as possible, and sometimes that's not the role of the teacher. Sometimes that is just building their relationship and engagement with other children in that school. So as you're saying, having other children doesn't need to be P7. It could be a primary 4 going down and just helping for an afternoon in the nursery. It's just making links to familiar faces and building that relationship. Sometimes I think it's actually better if it's not primary 7. So they're going to be there for a little longer, yeah.
I do know one particular wee chap who spent more time with his P7 buddy than a lot of his other P1 cohort, but because he got on so well with the P7 buddy and loved them so much, They spent
Yeah.
ages. So whenever she then moved up to secondary school the following year, kid was heartbroken. So whereas if it had been a P4 buddy or a P5 buddy, then they would have still had that little bit more
Yeah.
time to, yeah.
Exactly. And what you're saying there as well about linking up with a teacher mentor, it's not something to take offense at. If the child, it's not that they don't have a good relationship with you, but actually having that established before the year begins can be really helpful for everyone, because it allows them to have that more objective kind of person to perhaps challenge them on areas of that are presenting as perhaps difficult, or it'll allow them to have conversations with them about situations, or supportive conversations that you don't necessarily have time or access for or to. And that's not a failure of you as a class teacher or something to be offended at. It's actually just that more wider picture, holistic support and holistic working. And that you might be that person another year that they've identified. But I've had children in P6, P7 who still went down and spoke with their nursery teacher, because for them, that nursery period was really critical and a period of huge importance to them. And that relationship that they had at that time was something that they established, and we got on great, but it wasn't, I wasn't them. And it was just someone else that was familiar and safe for them to go and speak to. So if you know that there's a PSA in the classroom that this child or young person is really connected to or has a great relationship with, and you know that they're not coming with the child, so to speak, or they're not going to be working with them, there's no reason why it might not be suitable for them to check in with them every Friday afternoon and just have that open space. And they might use it, they might not. So, but it can really help now, if you allow that and have that conversation with them and say that you're going to be able to meet Mrs. McCallum on a Friday morning, and that's going to be so great. You're going to tell her all about the other, your new teachers and who else you're working with now. And that can just be enough. And whether they do or not, but they might choose not to at that stage, but it just can help to reduce anxiety there as well for that transition.
Absolutely. There is some other, for primary to secondary, we have a put in for secondary and beyond, because we know that sometimes people will go back and have a look at slides, and not every secondary student stays till the end of the year before they head off, especially if you've got students who are coming up to a certain age group and they might want to move at some point. So we thought that would be handy to keep in. But I do think that visit to school on an in-service day before the term starts can just be so handy. And I think, as a teacher, it's really nice to be able to see them in a different kind of, it is still the classroom environment, but it is still a bit of a different setting, because you can be that little bit more relaxed, you can be that little bit more open in a way that maybe you wouldn't be able to whenever you've got an entire classroom full of people. So yeah, I think that's something that we would definitely be recommending everybody if they can. But we are also aware that you may be getting assigned a pupil who has not been in school for the last year for a huge number of different reasons. So it could be because of school phobia or school refusal. It could be that they were home educated or they were homeschooled before. It could be that they're new to the area and things as well. So it's really important to have a talk with the pupil about why school hadn't been accessible for them before. So that can bring up some trauma. I think it's really mindful to be, really be aware that might bring up some past trauma. But if you don't find out why school hadn't been accessible in the past, then you could then inadvertently create an inaccessible environment too. And sometimes it can be things that other folks just really, really wouldn't be considering, like the lighting, having peers marking your work whenever it's something that you're particularly anxious about. It could be about, using the changing rooms and things. So speak with them about what happened before that made school inaccessible, and be really, really gentle about that sort of thing as well. So make sure that they've got plenty of support whenever they're talking about this, and talk to the parents about what they feel that the pupil might need too, because it's possible that the pupil will have opened up to their family or, you know, to another carer about what's happened in a way that they might not feel confident talking to you about. But that needs to be a really delicate conversation, but it's a really important one to have, because again, every pupil has that right to an accessible environment. And if you've got a pupil who has that trauma background, who has found school inaccessible before, their anxiety at coming back into the classroom is going to be really high. So it's very, very important that things are put in before they go into the classroom. And supporting the pupil to advocate what they are going to need support with for moving forward. If they're aged between sort of 12 and 15, then there is My Rights, My Say, which can help people to advocate, and there are other advocacy services that are out there too. But giving them that opportunity to really speak about what they need going forward, and making sure that you properly listen to it. Many autistic people have the experience where we would say, I find that difficult because of this sensory input. And then other people will then rubbish that idea. Oh, but it's not that noisy. It's not that bright. It's not that loud. It's not that scratchy. But to us, it is. And it takes a lot of courage when people have told you that your senses are wrong, which happens to pretty much every autistic person. To come forward and say that you have this experience and you need someone to do something about it takes a huge amount of effort and a tremendous amount of courage to do that. So if they do that, then it's really important that you listen and you support them on that one. Otherwise, you'll just be yet another adult who tells them that they're wrong. And they've already had plenty of that if they've not been in school before. Is that fair to say, Hayley?
Yeah, and for those that aren't able to actually pinpoint it and perhaps verbalize it, to, you know, having identified that that is what's bothering them, that's your and our role to do that, and to make sure that we're I suppose advocating on their behalf. You know, that's our role, is to ensure that we are meeting their needs. And if they are displaying that they are distressed in any way, but can't tell you why, then that's our job to step in and try and work out with them what it might be. And just to reinforce that about that point that you made about speaking with the child or young person and the parents about why school hasn't been accessible for however and whatever reasons. A lot of the work I do now is with children and young people who are not in school or accessing the school building. So I would say probably 9 times out of 10, the reason that I'm given as to why they're not accessing school is not the actual reason that the young person, child, or parents then give me when I speak with them. It can be very generalized, you know, they're anxious to come back to school, but that's all I get. And sometimes it can be very direct and sort of identified issues that are quite complex that then go beyond. So the classroom's too crowded and noisy. So what can we do to eliminate that? Then when we look at that further, it moves into another issue and another issue and another issue, which is then, you know, absolutely the child or young person is anxious and is anxious about school. But you don't get anywhere with kind of making assumptions. And I've done it so many times. I've gone, okay, I know what the issue is here. I can help with that. And I start doing a piece of work or offering support, and it's totally not helping or having any benefit at all, because it's not actually what they need or what they have, you know, spoken you know, to me about afterwards. So that is, as part of my practice now, is the first step is speaking with the child, young person, parents, and getting more of a view of the situation and identified needs.
I think one of the big other issues that we face quite a lot as an organization is that a lot of people don't necessarily understand and their own needs as an autistic person. So they don't understand that their brain is built in a physically different way. They might not realize that they have sensory differences or that they have communication differences. And they might not realize what their rights are. Given that they're disabled, they do have additional rights that do need to be respected as well. So making sure that they understand who they are and that it's absolutely okay to be the way that they are. Because
we know statistically that a lot of autistic individuals have experienced and continue to experience trauma, and that's not, we're not saying that to scare anyone or to kind of make us feel bad in education and that we're not meeting their needs, but it is just a fact that we've talked about that before. Trauma to you is not trauma to me, and it's a very personal thing. But a lot, it's true what you're saying, that a lot of autistic children, young people, don't understand themselves and how, have a sense of their own identity and have been shamed for many of their behaviours or stresses or anxieties or triggers in the past, which have impacted their ability to understand themselves. And so, when you say that, I had this conversation recently with a young boy, and he'd said to me, I feel like I have to rock when I see the cars passing me. And I said, we talked about that very, an in-depth conversation, and we talked about sensory needs and stimming and kind of the stimulation of the sound and the noise and the speed and the wind in his face of everything. And at the end, he was like, oh yeah, I didn't know that was a thing, and so then we talked about others, and I was great that I could have that conversation with someone. You can't always have that depth of conversation, but it's listening to them and identifying it alongside them, not for them, and validating them as individuals along the way.
Absolutely. And I think even whenever some autistic students are aware that they are different from their classmates, sometimes it can be difficult to put in some of the supports because they're not accepting them themselves. And that's where it's really important to have that incredibly inclusive ethos in the class, that it is okay for everybody to have different needs, whether they're autistic or not. And it's really important that those needs are met. And it really is okay for school not to be traditional. It's absolutely fine not to work the way that your next door your stage partner is working, or the person down the hall is working. Your classroom can be the way that it has to be for that particular student, and that particular student might need a really rigid routine, or they might need no routine at all. That particular student might need loads of sensory input, or they might need minimal sensory input, because they're all massively individual. So it's totally fine for them to have those different needs and for you to be creative about how to meet them. But the more we understand what we need as autistic people, and the more we accept that that's what we need, the easier it is to put these things into place, and then the better the outcome it is for absolutely everybody, and that includes school staff, isn't it?
Yeah, and often just opening that, inclusive relational aspect with individuals and allowing yourself to be human and, normalizing how they feel with how you feel is the way that you build that trust and that inclusive ethos within your classroom. I had a child recently who was screaming, and it was excitable screaming, and they were having a great time, and they were very overstimulated and excited, and I said, and I did, I had a sore head, and I said, can you please stop screaming, or can you reduce the noise level? And that wasn't met with a very receptive response. And then when I said, it's actually the noise is really hurting my head, and just opening that up, and I said, I find noise a little bit sore sometimes. That was it, a change, because I had allowed myself to be vulnerable and open with them, and I was human and relational. And there's often huge assumptions and misconceptions that they won't understand other people's emotions, and they don't understand empathy, or they don't have empathy, and it's very wildly the other way around. And I'm just, as me as a person, I'm very unfiltered, but I'm very real and relational, and I think that's the biggest power that teachers have and support staff have in schools, is just being who you are and allowing them to be who they are, and just being vulnerable and real with them allows that to happen.
Yeah, oh, definitely. And then that kind of really does lead into that revisiting the sensory profile for everybody. And it is possible that if you've got 2 autistic students in the class and potentially an autistic staff member, that you're going to have clashing needs. So it's about meeting what is the most important need at that time. And, you don't have to have the entire classroom as a place that you can do loads of sensory seeking. You can have areas where there is more sensory seeking than not. But our our environmental checklist that we've got, which you can find on our website, I popped in a hyperlink there. So whenever you get the PDF of this, then you should be able to click onto the hyperlink to get access to that. And you can use that to set up different areas within the class that's going to help to meet those different needs. And I think the really key thing is flexibility, because as an autistic person, my sensory profile changes a lot, particularly when there's hormones that are floating around or not floating around. And it changes when I'm really stressed, it changes when I'm hungry, it changes when I'm tired. So knowing that you might need to increase sensory input at some point and then decrease it at another point, allowing for that flexibility really is good practice, isn't it?
And it can change just depending on where you are, what environment, and simply who's around you and them.
Yeah.
It's not that they don't like them or dislike, there's just everyone's a different mix of people, different personalities, can heighten different senses. So it's a continually changing, sort of needs and process of sensory kind of experience.
Absolutely. And again, I know we've said this before, and I think it's one of the most important things that we can just say again and again. Make sure that these correct supports are put into place before the transition takes place. So before the student comes into your classroom, make sure that it's all done so that they know what to expect whenever they come in. And again, if possible, a visit to school on the in-service day before the term starts. That'll allow those up-to-date photos with the room as it's actually going to look the next day. It's going to allow that last opportunity to ask some questions so that they can sleep well that night before they go in. Because I certainly know a lot of families who will say to us that if the child knows that they've got school the next day and they don't know what it's going to look like, they may not sleep well that night at all, if they sleep in the first place. So if you want the people to be coming in well rested, ready for the day, as excited as you are to meet your class, giving them all the information that they want before they go in is going to make it a lot easier, isn't it?
Yeah, and be prepared for very off-topic questions. It's very unlikely that it'll be anything to do with the room that you've spent weeks beautifully decorating, or their seat or the toilets or anything. I had that last term, and they came and they said, I always remember, did you ever go to the zoo before? And that was the type of questions that was important for this child. And often you will find the questions that come are very linked into their special interests, and that the wider picture of that is helping them to connect and relate to you as a new relationship, but also allowing them to reduce their anxiety of rejection, I suppose, as well, and they're trying to suss you out and pitch you as to how interested in them are you going to be, how invested are you going to be, and how much can I be calm and myself in this classroom and with you. So it's every question is valid, is what I would say, as no matter how wildly off topic it may seem at the time.
Those are the fun questions though, aren't they?
Absolutely.
But
questions.
I think it's quite important that one of the ways that autistic people do bond with each other is through those shared interests and talking about them at length. And we use the term info dumping to talk about it, is where you might have a lot of information about a specific topic, and then you go and you share that information with the other person. And that is a really key, important way. So they might come into the classroom and give you 15 facts about SpongeBob SquarePants, but that's them letting you know who they are, what they're about, what their sense of humor is like, how they like to spend their time. you know, there's a lot of information that can be gleaned from that about that child, as well as about SpongeBob SquarePants.
Yeah, and they might not be interested in your 16th fact either, and that's not anything to be offended at. But just the fact that you've sat and listened to them and not interrupted, shown interest, and then responded is enough.
Well,
It's just, yeah, that is what it's about.
absolutely. Just about finished off now. So we've got this fantastic image that we really like, sort of looking at equality, equity, and justice. And I think that's a really, really important one for an awful lot of us, because at the moment, for a lot of autistic students, they are not getting access to the education. And equality, giving them exactly the same as everybody else, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to get access to education. They're going to need different things, and that's absolutely fine. Because it's the professional's responsibility to making sure that that education is as accessible to the autistic students as it is to everybody else. Because autistic people can learn and grow and develop, and you never know what it is that they're going to achieve. And I think just the last couple of key takeaways: autistic students have a legal right to have their needs met in school. And it really is just that simple, isn't it, Hayley?
Yeah. There's no, what that might look like is not necessarily straightforward or simple, but that is their legal right.
And there are some of those practical steps for reasonable adjustments should be made before the pupil comes into class where possible, so that the classroom is set up for them on day one. And the difference that makes in terms of making them feel included, wanted, respected is absolutely enormous. And that's a really key thing for building that relationship with them. Again, we've got a little link into our downloadable documents, and on there's information on how to make a sensory profile that the family can fill out, and also the environmental checklist. So you can use those two documents together to make sure that the environment in your classroom is going to fit their needs as they need it. Still have fun?
So important for the parents as well, though, you know, that they see that you're for them and you're working with them and you're acknowledging that there is a need for adjustment to support them. You know, it's the wider picture there as well. And often the parents, they experience enough challenge and discrimination and shame often, you know, for the very fact that their child has a disability that makes certain things more challenging or difficult. And so they place a lot of trust and in us as education, you know, to support them and to support meeting their child's needs and helping them to thrive and progress. So it's a very privileged position to be in, but it's also a huge responsibility, and one that is because, you know, we know from what is noted as our responsibility legally, but also it's important enough that it's been identified by law that these are necessary adjustments. So it's important that we do kind of take that time to consider what a reasonable adjustment is, and that could be quite a big adjustment for us, it could be quite a small adjustment, but it'll be a very reasonable one for them, and that's what the way we need to view that. And just to finish off, you know, it is about justice and not equality. As I said, you know, school for some children, young people will never take or look as traditional form, as sitting in a classroom and learning or engaging that way, and that's okay. And don't be scared of that. I get a lot of teachers contacting me who are very anxious about them not doing enough or meeting their needs because they're not accessing their classroom, or they're not necessarily doing the activities that are set for them. But that's okay. That's not the stress. It's okay, they're not accessing that. So what can we do that they can access? And that might look very, very different. So my advice to you is not to worry about that or not to stress about that, but to to keep that takeaway as it's about justice, not equality, and that we can make those reasonable adjustments which can help them beyond measure.
It means so much, doesn't it?
It does.
It genuinely.
And the very fact that you're all here today does show your commitment, and we are genuinely very thankful. We know it's really warm outside. Everyone's needing their tea and their holidays and their bed and their wherever you are. So you all are wonderful for joining us today, and we would be really, really thankful. As ever, we do evaluate the CPDs that we do, and we take that into huge consideration, which has and continues to inform what trainings we put together for next session. So if you have a spare 2 minutes, the evaluation forms in the chat, we would absolutely love it if you could take that time to let us know and give us feedback, constructive as well. We will take it all on board. And we will respond to the needs that's out there in schools, which we have noted, and we've already got a few lined up, haven't we, Marion, in response to some of the.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording just now, so then we can stop that.
Perfect.
Yeah, so there we go.